Beware the Wendigo, Chapter 1. The Whispering Pines. The fog had settled thick over the winding roads by the time Anna Rivers crossed the county line, her headlights cutting through the mist like a thin beam of light trying to pierce through an endless wall. The woods stretched on for miles, gnarled trees rising like twisted sentinels on either side of the road, their skeletal branches clawing at the sky. The air was heavy, damp with the weight of an early autumn chill that clung to her skin, seeping into her bones. A storm was coming, but she couldn't tell if it was the weather or something else, something that had nothing to do with nature, that made her feel uneasy. Anna glanced at the map once more, even though she knew she was heading in the right direction. Pine Hollow, a small town deep in the Wisconsin woods. The kind of place that tourists would skip over without a second glance, and locals rarely spoke of. But it wasn't the quaint charm of the town that had drawn her here. It was the whispers. The stories that had been circulating for years about the mysterious disappearances, the strange deaths, and the peculiar tales surrounding the forest that seemed to devour people whole. The town's inhabitants had kept quiet for the most part, dismissing the rumors as folk tales. But something about the pattern of disappearances had intrigued Anna. She had spent weeks digging into the town's history, tracking down every possible clue she could find about the cursed legends that swirled around Pine Hollow. Whispers of the Wendigo. Whispers of a creature that stalked the woods, feeding on the greedy and the desperate. She had written about folklore and urban legends before, but nothing had felt as real as this. Nothing had felt like it was waiting, watching, creeping up behind her with every turn she made. She thought back to her conversation with her editor, who had warned her about the dangers of getting too deep into such a story. There were limits to how far she should push, he'd said. People like that, small towns, don't like outsiders poking around, he'd added with a chuckle, though there was an edge to his voice. But Anna didn't care. She had to know the truth. The tires of her car crunched on the gravel road as she drove deeper into the dense woods. The trees seemed to grow closer together, their canopies blocking out much of the sunlight, casting the road into a twilight gloom. Her eyes flicked nervously between the road and the dense forest surrounding her, the feeling of being watched intensifying with every passing second. She could almost hear the whisper of the wind, faintly echoing through the trees as if the forest was speaking to her, urging her to turn back, to leave the mystery alone. But she didn't listen. Anna had arrived at Pine Hollow just as the sun had begun to dip below the horizon, casting the town in an eerie half-light. She could see the small cluster of buildings as she approached, a sleepy little settlement that looked like it had been frozen in time. Old wooden houses, their windows dark and vacant, their porches sagging with neglect. The streets were empty, as if everyone had decided to stay inside, to close themselves off from the outside world. It was as if the town itself had been abandoned by time, left to rot in a place forgotten by history. The only sign of life was a single street lamp flickering in the distance, its weak light casting long shadows across the street. The wind whispered through the trees again, the sound like the soft murmur of something just out of reach, something that was waiting. She pulled up to the old inn, a place that looked as though it had been standing for centuries. The sign hanging above the door creaked in the wind, its letters faded and worn. The innkeeper, an older woman with sharp, probing eyes, had given her a strange, almost knowing look when Anna had introduced herself. "Not many come here with questions," she had said quietly, her voice a low rasp, as if speaking any louder might disturb the air around them. "But if you're looking for answers, be prepared to face what's been buried." The warning had made Anna uneasy, but she hadn't let it show. She thanked the woman and took the key to her room. She had no plans to stay for long, just enough time to get what she needed for the story. She couldn't afford to linger, not when the whispers were getting louder in her head, urging her to push further into the town's secrets. Anna unpacked her things in the small, dimly lit room, her eyes constantly drawn to the window that looked out over the woods. It was dark now, the forest an impenetrable black mass that seemed to stretch on forever. The feeling of being watched intensified, and the whispering wind outside seemed to carry with it an almost tangible sense of malice. She pulled the blinds shut, trying to block out the view. But as she turned away from the window, she couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was standing just beyond the glass, watching her every move. After a restless night spent tossing and turning, Anna woke to a town still shrouded in a thick fog. the streets eerily quiet. She had been told by the innkeeper that the best place to start her investigation was at the local diner, where the townsfolk gathered to gossip. Anna hoped to get some insight from the locals about the disappearances, perhaps a hint about the truth behind the Wendigo tales. The diner was just a short walk from the inn, and as Anna stepped out onto the main street, she couldn't shake the feeling that the town was holding its breath. The silence hung in the air like a thick fog, suffocating and oppressive. She walked briskly, her footsteps muffled by the wet pavement, and reached the diner's door. The bell above it jingled faintly as she entered, and she was greeted by the warm glow of yellow lights, the smell of strong coffee, and the hum of muted conversation. The diner was small, with a handful of worn booths lining the walls. A few elderly patrons sat scattered around, sipping coffee and speaking in hushed tones. The waitress behind the counter glanced up at Anna as she entered, her eyes narrow, calculating. She didn't smile, but she didn't seem hostile either, just wary. Anna took a seat at the counter and ordered coffee, scanning the room for anyone who might offer information. The conversations around her stopped briefly as the townsfolk eyed her with suspicion, but no one spoke. She could feel the weight of their stares, the discomfort that radiated from them like a thick, oppressive fog. After a few moments, an older man with a weathered face and rough hands turned toward her. He was wearing a faded flannel shirt and a baseball cap that shielded most of his graying hair. His eyes were dark, sunken, and he had a look that said he had seen things he wasn't eager to talk about. "You're new here," he said, his voice gruff, with a slight edge to it. "Not many folks come this way, and those who do, don't stay long." Anna hesitated for a moment before responding. "I'm doing a story on the town," she said carefully. "The disappearances, and the legend of the Wendigo." The man's face went pale, his eyes narrowing dangerously. "You'd be better off leaving that alone," he muttered under his breath, before turning back to his coffee and refusing to say another word. The air in the diner grew heavier, as though something had shifted, something that had made everyone uncomfortable. But Anna didn't let it deter her. She wasn't going to back down. Not now. She had to uncover the truth, no matter what it cost. As she sipped her coffee, the waitress came over, her eyes cold and calculating. "You're here for the Wendigo, aren't you?" she asked, her voice low, almost a hiss. "Well, be careful what you dig up. Some things here are better left buried. You've been warned." The warning was clear. Pine Hollow had secrets, dark, ancient secrets, and Anna was about to uncover them, no matter the cost. But as she left the diner, a sinking feeling settled in her stomach. The wind howled through the trees outside, the branches shaking violently. The fog seemed thicker than before, wrapping around her like a blanket of impending doom. The woods were calling, and Anna knew she had no choice but to answer. Chapter 2. Into the woods. The air outside the diner felt heavier than it had before, as though the very atmosphere of Pine Hollow was breathing in rhythm with Anna. The fog, which had seemed like a passing chill earlier, now enveloped her completely, clinging to her skin like an unseen hand, pulling her deeper into the heart of the town. The sensation was almost suffocating, a sense that the air itself was thick with something, unspoken, ancient. She could almost taste the moisture in it, and beneath that, something darker, something wrong. Anna had felt it the moment she set foot in this place, that eerie sense that something was off, lurking just beneath the surface of the quaint old town. The fog seemed to mask more than just the streetlights. It was as if it was trying to smother something alive, something watching. There were shadows where there shouldn't be, and each one felt like it was breathing, stretching just beyond her sight. The townsfolk had made it clear they didn't want her here, that they weren't ready for someone like her poking around. Their faces had been wary, and in some cases even fearful. But Anna was no stranger to places like this, and the more they urged her to leave, the more determined she became. The mystery of Pine Hollow was too strong to ignore, and the eerie calm that hung over the town only spurred her forward. There were too many unanswered questions. People were disappearing, and whispers of the Wendigo danced on every corner of this cursed place. Anna wasn't someone to back down from a story, no matter how dark or twisted it was. She would uncover the truth, even if the truth was something she couldn't understand. As she made her way back to the inn, her steps quick and purposeful, the sounds around her seemed amplified. Every crack of a twig beneath her boots, every rustle of the wind through the dense trees lining the street felt exaggerated. Too loud, too present. The forest felt alive, watching her, listening to her every movement. The sense of being followed pressed against her, like invisible eyes trailing her every step. Though she told herself it was just the nerves that came with stepping into a town so thick with secrets, she couldn't shake the feeling that something in those woods was more than just an animal, something darker, something otherworldly. The town was quiet, too quiet. The streetlights flickered in the fog, their soft orange glow casting long shadows across the streets. The shops were closed, and not a single person walked the streets. The occasional stray cat slinked through an alleyway, its eyes gleaming like orbs of fire. But there was no one else, no one brave enough, or foolish enough, to be out in this dense fog at this hour. The heavy door to the inn creaked as Anna pushed it open, and the warm light inside briefly shielded her from the oppressive cold that had settled outside. Mrs. Larkin, the innkeeper, stood behind the front desk, her eyes locked on Anna as she entered. Her hands were folded neatly in front of her, but there was something in the old woman's gaze that Anna couldn't quite place. It wasn't fear, exactly. More like concern, but a concern laced with something else, something darker. "You've been poking around, haven't you, Mrs.?" Larkin's voice was low, gravelly, like the rustling of dried leaves in the wind. Her words were not a question, but a statement, an observation wrapped in warning. "That's not a good idea, dear. Not for you. Not for anyone." Anna hesitated for a moment, feeling the weight of those words pressing on her. It wasn't the first warning she'd received since arriving in Pine Hollow. The air here was thick with a sense of unease, and the warnings from the townsfolk had been frequent, though never as blunt as Mrs. Larkin's. "I'm just looking for answers," Anna said, her voice wavering slightly despite her best attempt at sounding calm. "The disappearances, the Wendigo. I need to understand what happened to them." Mrs. Larkin's face hardened slightly, and her eyes narrowed in suspicion. The room seemed to grow colder, as though the temperature had dropped with the mention of the creature that haunted the town's history. "There are things in those woods that no one should ever try to understand," she muttered under her breath, her voice barely audible. Her gaze shifted, and for a moment, Anna thought she saw something flicker in the innkeeper's eyes, something akin to fear. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. Things that should have stayed buried. It's not just stories, you know, not just a myth. Anna stepped closer, her curiosity piqued by the woman's sudden shift in demeanor. Mrs. Larkin, however, quickly shook her head, her hands instinctively clutching at the edge of the counter. It was a gesture of warning, an unspoken plea for Anna to back off. She could see it now. There was something deeper in Mrs. Larkin's expression, something that suggested the woman knew more than she was letting on. "Go to the library, Mrs. Larkin said finally, her tone colder than before, more detached. "It's the only place in town with any answers. But be careful. The forest is never quiet. And it has memories." The last phrase, "it has memories," clung to Anna as she left the inn. A shiver ran down her spine as she made her way down the fog-drenched streets toward the library, the words echoing in her mind. The notion of a forest with memories seemed ridiculous at first, until Anna considered the strange sensation she had felt earlier, as though the trees themselves were watching, listening. Pine Hollow wasn't just a town frozen in time. It was a place that felt alive, its very history pressing down on her with an intensity that was almost suffocating. As she walked further, the fog thickened, swallowing the streets whole. The buildings that once appeared as quaint, picturesque cottages now loomed like dark silhouettes in the mist. It was as though the town was slowly sinking into the earth, hidden from view by the thick veil of fog that hung over everything. The few streetlights were almost useless, their dim glow barely cutting through the ever-growing gloom. The air seemed heavier with each step she took, and Anna's sense of unease grew. The fog wasn't just a natural occurrence. It felt like something more, something deliberate, as though the land itself was trying to keep its secrets buried. She could hear nothing now. The usual sounds of a small town at night were absent. No cars driving by, no distant chatter from the houses. It was as if the whole town was holding its breath. When she finally reached the library, Anna paused for a moment, hesitant to push open the door. The building stood dark and imposing in the gloom, its stone facade weathered and aged. She could feel the weight of the place, a quiet gravity that pulled her toward it. The ancient windows, clouded with grime, seemed to reflect no light, and the door creaked loudly when she pushed it open, as if it hadn't been disturbed in years. Inside, the air was thick with the musty scent of old books, damp wood, and the faint odor of mildew. The dim, flickering overhead bulb cast long shadows over the rows of shelves, which seemed to stretch on forever. The library was nearly empty, save for a few scattered patrons hunched in corners, reading or staring into space, their faces pale and hollow-eyed, as though they were all residents of Pine Hollow, who had lost something essential, perhaps their souls, perhaps their will. Anna walked deeper into the library, her footsteps muffled by the worn carpet. She ran her fingers along the spines of the books as she moved, her curiosity building with every shelf she passed. Her mind raced as she thought of the cryptic warning Mrs. Larkin had given her, but she pushed the thought aside. The answers she needed were here. She just had to find them. As she wandered deeper into the aisles, the low, gravelly voice of an older man interrupted her thoughts. "You're looking in the wrong place." Anna's heart skipped a beat as she spun around, startled. She found herself face to face with an elderly man, hunched over with age. His long, frail fingers were curled around the edge of a tattered book, and his clothes hung loosely from his skeletal frame. His hair was wispy and grey, and his eyes, hidden beneath the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat, seemed to glint with an unsettling light. "You won't find the truth in these books," he continued, his voice a soft rasp, almost drowned by the heavy silence that hung in the air. "You need to go to the woods. That's where the answers are." Anna's throat tightened, her pulse quickening with both fear and curiosity. She wanted to ask him what he meant, but his gaze, fixed on her with an intensity that sent a chill down her spine, seemed to stop her from speaking. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. "The woods! What's out there?" The man's lips curled into a grimace, his smile twisted and unsettling. "The Wendigo. It's out there. It's always been out there. And it remembers those who came before." Anna's mind raced, her heart pounding as she tried to make sense of what he was saying. This man was no stranger. He knew something far darker than the locals had let on. The Wendigo. She had heard the legend mentioned time and time again, but this man, his very presence exuded a dark knowledge, something beyond mere folklore. "I need to know more," Anna said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Why is it here? Why does it haunt the town?" The man took a slow step toward her, his movements deliberate. He lowered his voice to a near whisper, as though the very walls might be listening. "Because it's hungry. It feeds on the sins of the living and the dead. And Pine Hollow." He paused, his eyes narrowing with something akin to recognition. Before he finished, "It's full of hunger. You'll see." With that, he turned and shuffled deeper into the dark aisles of the library, his presence leaving Anna standing there, alone, the oppressive weight of his words hanging heavily in the air. She didn't understand what he meant, but she could feel it. Something gnawing deep in her gut, something cold and dread-filled. The forest, the Wendigo, the hunger, it was all connected. Anna knew one thing for sure now. She had to go into the woods. She had no choice. The town was hiding something, and the deeper she dug, the more it seemed like Pine Hollow was drawing her into its secrets, unwilling to let her walk away. The answers lay somewhere in the trees, somewhere deep within the shadows. And so, with the words of the strange old man still echoing in her mind, Anna set off toward the forest. She could feel the eyes of Pine Hollow upon her, and she didn't know if she was walking into a trap or toward a truth she might not survive. But she had come too far to turn back now. End of Chapter 2, Into the Woods. In this extended chapter, Anna delves deeper into the unsettling atmosphere of Pine Hollow, meeting mysterious characters like the cryptic old man and hearing further warnings about the Wendigo. The tension continues to mount as the eerie town and its haunted forest seem to have a life of their own, compelling Anna to venture into the woods despite the dangers. The chapter builds with an escalating sense of dread, leaving Anna and the reader with the unnerving realization that the truth may be more horrific than she ever imagined. Chapter 3. The Legend of the Wendigo. The wind outside howled through the trees, a mournful sound that seemed to reverberate in Anna's bones as she hurried back to the inn. Her steps were quick, nearly frantic, as though she could outrun the growing dread that clung to her every movement, tightening with every breath she took. The fog had returned, but now it was thicker, more oppressive, swirling in the air like tendrils of some ancient, forgotten creature, its presence palpable, waiting to sink its claws into her. The mist crept up the sides of the buildings like silent spectres, crawling closer to her with each step she took. The air was colder now, colder than it had been when she first arrived in Pine Hollow, and it seeped into her bones, making her chest tighten and her breath catch in her throat. She could feel the fog wrapping around her, clinging to her skin, but it wasn't the physical cold that unsettled her. It was the sensation that the fog itself was alive, watching her, waiting for her to slip. The town, so quiet and sleepy earlier, now felt like something else entirely. It was as though the very air had thickened with history, with ancient secrets too terrible to speak of. Anna could feel it. The town was holding its breath, and she was too deep into it now to back away. The weight of the town's legacy pressed down on her, making it harder to breathe, harder to think. The more she uncovered, the darker it seemed to grow. Her mind kept drifting back to the old man's words. The Wendigo. It remembers those who came before. His voice had been low, hoarse, like the whisper of dry leaves in the wind, and his eyes, hidden beneath the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat, had burned with an intensity that unnerved her. She had pressed him for answers, but he had only given her fragments of a story, each one darker than the last. The Wendigo wasn't just a creature, wasn't just some malevolent force waiting to devour. No, it was something much deeper. It was an infection, a curse, something that had been in Pine Hollow long before Anna had set foot here. The library had given her little more than cryptic warnings, and the residents of Pine Hollow were no help. They were as terrified of the Wendigo as they were of what might happen if they spoke its name too loudly. They wanted to forget, wanted to bury the horrors of the past deep in the earth and pretend that it had all been a myth. But Anna was past the point of turning back. She could feel the pull of the mystery, the pull of the truth. Something in the woods was waiting, and she had to understand what it was. By the time Anna reached the inn, the sky had darkened, blanketing Pine Hollow in a darkness so complete it felt unnatural. The quiet town was half asleep, but this silence felt different. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a small rural town at night. It was the eerie stillness of a place that had long since given up hope. The streets were empty, save for the occasional rustle of the leaves in the trees. The wind had picked up again, making the branches creak and sway like the groans of some unseen ancient creature stirring in its sleep. As Anna stepped through the door of the inn, she felt the weight of the outside world lift from her shoulders, but only slightly. The warmth inside the inn was a stark contrast to the bitter cold outside, but it only made the sense of foreboding more pronounced. It felt like stepping into the belly of a beast, a temporary safety perhaps, but one that couldn't protect her for long. Elaine, Robert's mother, sat by the hearth in a rocking chair, the fire casting long shadows that seemed to stretch across the room like fingers. Her face was gaunt, tired, but her eyes gleamed with a strange, knowing look that made Anna pause before crossing the room. Her hands were folded in her lap, and though she didn't speak, the atmosphere in the room made it clear that she was waiting for Anna to ask the question she already knew was coming. "You're back," Elaine said softly, her voice carrying the weight of something unspoken, something both resigned and dark. She didn't look up from her knitting, but her words were heavy. "The woods aren't what they seem, you know. No one goes in and comes out the same. But then again, some never come out at all." The words hit Anna like a cold gust of wind, her chest tightening as she tried to process what Elaine was saying. It wasn't just a warning. It was a fact, one that carried the weight of the town's grim history. Elaine's tone wasn't simply cautionary. It was filled with the kind of fear that came from knowing something terrible that couldn't be undone. "I need to know more about the Wendigo," Anna said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. She stepped closer, sitting down across from Elaine, her hands trembling slightly as she braced herself for what she knew would come. Please, you have to tell me. Elaine's gaze flickered briefly to Anna's, and the silence in the room seemed to stretch between them, thick with years of unspoken grief. Then, Elaine's lips curled into a tight, bitter smile, but it wasn't a smile that conveyed warmth. It was the smile of someone who had lived through horrors that had etched themselves into her soul. I told you, child, Elaine murmured, her voice dropping to a whisper. Some things aren't meant to be uncovered. Her fingers tightened around the knitting she had been working on, as if it were a lifeline. The Wendigo is real, but it's not a creature you can just study. It's a curse, a hunger that's been passed down through the blood of this town for generations. And when the Wendigo claims someone, it doesn't just take their body. It takes their soul. It feeds on them, twists them into something else. Anna leaned forward, her pulse quickening with the weight of the woman's words. She had heard stories, of course, the stories everyone told when they spoke of the Wendigo, but hearing it from someone who had lived with its presence for so long made the terror real in a way she hadn't expected. But why? Why does it do this? Anna pressed, her voice cracking. Why does it come? Why now? Elaine set the knitting aside and leaned back, her eyes distant as though she was lost in the shadows of time. Her voice grew softer, as though recounting a tale that she had told too many times before. It started long ago, she said, her voice filled with sorrow. Before this town was even founded, the first settlers, they weren't just looking for a place to build a home. They were driven by something darker. Greed. The land was fertile, untouched by man, and they saw it as their opportunity to take everything for themselves. They thought they could tame it. But they didn't understand the forest, didn't understand the spirits that lived there. She paused, her hands shaking as she folded them in her lap. They made a pact, an offering to the forest, to the spirits that dwelled within it. They wanted power, wealth, and land, and they thought they could take it all without consequence. Elaine's face hardened as she spoke, her voice dropping lower, but they didn't understand what they were dealing with. The forest wasn't just a place, it was alive, and it had been waiting for the greedy to come. They summoned something ancient, something that had been sleeping in the woods for centuries. The Wendigo was born from that greed, from that hunger. It feeds on those who take too much, and it never stops. It consumes everything. It leaves nothing behind but hunger. Anna's chest tightened as the weight of Elaine's words sank in. She had read about the Wendigo before, the creature twisted by hunger and cannibalism, but hearing it spoken of in such dark terms, from someone who had lived in its shadow, made it feel more real, more tangible. It wasn't just a story. It was a curse that had bled into the very fabric of Pine Hollow. But why did it leave? Anna asked, her voice trembling with uncertainty. Why hasn't it come back until now? Elaine's gaze hardened, and for a moment, Anna saw something flash in her eyes. It wasn't fear, it was recognition. Recognition of something that Anna hadn't fully grasped. Something that had been here all along. Because it's always been here, Elaine said quietly, her voice cracking as though the weight of the years had caught up with her. Watching. Waiting. It doesn't need to hunt every year, but it never forgets. Not the people who came before, and not the ones who come now. She looked directly at Anna, her expression darkening. Robert's brother, Kev, was the first to go missing. He wandered into the woods, and when he came back, he wasn't the same. He wasn't human anymore. He was hungry. And when he attacked Robert, Elaine's voice faltered, and tears welled up in her eyes. She turned her head away, but the grief was still there, raw, unhealed. Anna's heart tightened. She could see the pain in Elaine's eyes, but she also knew that she had to understand. There was something else buried deep in those words. She had to press. Tell me what happened to Kev, Anna pressed, her voice urgent. What really happened? Elaine's eyes snapped back to her, and for a moment, Anna thought she saw something dark, something alive in her gaze. It wasn't just grief anymore. It was something much deeper, something darker, something fearful. You don't understand, Elaine whispered, her voice quivering. The Wendigo doesn't just take, It makes you want it. It makes you crave it, even if you know it's wrong. It takes your soul, your humanity, and leaves only hunger behind. Once it has you, there's no way back. Kev was lost before he even knew what was happening. He didn't stand a chance. Anna swallowed hard. The weight of Elaine's words pressed down on her like a heavy stone. She was caught in something far beyond her comprehension. Pine Hollow wasn't just a town steeped in secrets. It was a place cursed. A place where the hunger of the Wendigo had consumed everything in its path, from the settlers to the current inhabitants. But Robert... Anna's voice faltered as the realization began to hit. What happened to him? Elaine looked at her, the lines on her face deepening with a grief that Anna knew would never heal. Robert is lost too, she whispered. Not in the same way as Kev, but he's not the same boy he was. The Wendigo doesn't just take you physically. It leaves something behind. Something festers. It changes you from the inside. Robert. Elaine shook her head, her voice filled with sorrow and something else. Something darker. You won't understand until you see it for yourself. You need to go into the woods. You need to see what it is. What's waiting there? The weight of Elaine's words crushed Anna's chest, her mind racing with the knowledge that the Wendigo was no longer just a story. It was a part of Pine Hollow's curse. And now it was calling to her. She had no choice. She had to go into the woods. End of Chapter 3. The Legend of the Wendigo. This expanded version delves deeper into the town's cursed history, building on the terrifying legend of the Wendigo, while also exploring Anna's growing realization of the danger surrounding Pine Hollow. Elaine's warnings paint a chilling picture of the curse, leaving Anna, and the reader, with an overwhelming sense of dread and the understanding that there is no turning back now. Chapter 4. The Return of Kev. The wind had picked up again by the time Anna stepped out of the inn, a biting chill that seemed to slice through her coat. The fog had thickened, wrapping around the town like a shroud, making the familiar streets look distorted, foreign. The fog wasn't just an ordinary mist. It felt alive, as if it were aware of her every step, shifting and moving in response to her presence. She shuddered, but it wasn't from the cold. No, it was the overwhelming sense that the town was watching her, waiting for her to make the wrong move. The air smelled of damp earth and decay, a pungent reminder that Pine Hollow had been untouched for too long. It was as though the town had been forgotten by time, left to rot under the weight of its secrets. And those secrets, Anna knew, were just beneath the surface, waiting to resurface. The longer she stayed, the more she could feel herself being drawn into the town's dark history, like a moth to a flame. She wasn't just investigating the Wendigo anymore. She was walking straight into its den, and it was pulling her in whether she was ready or not. Elaine's words echoed in her mind as she walked down the fog-drenched streets. The Wendigo doesn't just take, it makes you want it. It makes you crave it, even if you know it's wrong. The thought unsettled her more than she cared to admit. The idea that the Wendigo didn't just consume, it corrupted, was more terrifying than anything she had read about in the countless books on the paranormal and the occult she had studied over the years. The Wendigo wasn't just an external force, it was a sickness, a curse that twisted the very essence of its victims, turning them into something unrecognizable, something other. And then, of course, there was Kev. His return, if it could even be called that, haunted Anna's thoughts. She had tried to push the image of him from her mind, the hollow eyes, the gaunt face, the unnerving grin. But it lingered, gnawing at the edges of her consciousness. He had been Robert's brother, a son, a person, and now he was something else. The Wendigo had taken him, and in doing so, had stolen his humanity, his soul. And the more Anna thought about it, the more she realized something chilling. If the Wendigo had claimed Kev, it was only a matter of time before it came for someone else. Someone like Robert. Or maybe, someone like her. She could feel the pull of the woods, the looming forest that stretched just beyond the town, calling her in a way that both terrified and compelled her. It wasn't just a place. It was a living, breathing entity. The trees seemed to whisper her name with each gust of wind, their branches creaking like old bones. The town was a cage, a place of false safety, and the woods were the key to whatever answers Pine Hollow held. She had to go. She had no choice. The streets were empty as she walked toward the edge of town, the buildings fading into the fog like ghosts in the distance. There were no sounds, no signs of life, except for the occasional flutter of a bat or the rustle of the trees. The only light was the faint glow from the street lamps, their illumination weak and hollow against the overwhelming dark. As she neared the forest's edge, the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. The trees loomed tall and dark, their twisted branches reaching into the sky like skeletal fingers. There was something menacing about them, something old and hungry. The closer Anna got, the more she could feel the air growing heavier, the atmosphere thick with something beyond the ordinary, something alive. Just before she stepped into the forest, she stopped and turned, as though expecting to find someone behind her. She wasn't sure what she was looking for. Perhaps a sign of reassurance. Perhaps an escape from the fear that had built up inside her. But there was nothing. Just the endless stretch of fog and trees. With a deep breath, Anna stepped forward, her footfall muffled by the thick carpet of leaves beneath her. The forest swallowed her whole. The air was damp, thick with the smell of decaying wood and wet moss. The light from the town seemed to fade the deeper she went, the trees growing denser, the shadows darker. It felt like walking into a tunnel that would lead her deeper into the unknown. She had been in forests before, but this felt different. There was a weight to it, a pressure that settled in her chest as though the woods were watching, waiting. The trees towered above her, their gnarled branches twisting together to form a canopy so thick it blocked out the sky. The deeper she walked, the darker it became. The fog had followed her in, curling around her like a thick mist of despair, cutting her off from everything outside. Every step she took felt heavy, each movement slow, deliberate, as if the forest itself was making her hesitate, making her think twice. The whispers of the trees seemed to grow louder, the creaking of the branches and the rustling of the leaves louder, as if the woods were alive, listening to her every move. The deeper she ventured, the more the sense of being followed intensified. Her breath came quicker now, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel it, the presence in the woods, something lurking just beyond her sight. She wasn't alone. She couldn't tell if it was just her nerves playing tricks on her, or if something was watching her from the shadows. But the feeling was real. It was undeniable. And then, there it was. The unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from behind her. Her heart skipped a beat. She turned quickly, but there was nothing. No one. Just the same fog, the same trees. She froze, her body tensing, straining to hear anything at all. But the forest was silent once more. Her pulse quickened, and she swallowed the lump in her throat. Keep moving, she told herself. She had come this far. There was no turning back now, but her legs felt heavy, as though the very forest itself was trying to keep her from going further. She felt the weight of the place settling in around her, its ancient power pressing down on her shoulders like a physical force. And then she saw it, a figure. Barely more than a silhouette at first, blending in with the fog and shadows. But then it stepped forward, slowly, purposefully, like a predator stalking its prey. Anna's breath caught in her throat. The figure was humanoid, but it wasn't quite right. It was too tall, too thin, its limbs unnaturally long. Its face was pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to absorb the light around them, reflecting nothing but emptiness. Anna's heart pounded in her chest as she took an involuntary step back. And then she heard it. A voice, gravelly, like something scraping across stone. Anna! Her heart skipped. The voice, it was familiar. The voice was his. Kev. The figure stepped closer, its movements jerky, unnatural. It was Kev. But it wasn't. His once youthful face was now a twisted mask of hunger, pale and gaunt. His skin stretched too tightly over his bones. His clothes hung loosely from his skeletal frame, torn and stained with something dark, something that looked like blood. No, Anna whispered, stepping back, her breath coming faster. This isn't you. Kev's lips curled into something that might have been a smile, but it was no smile at all. It was a grotesque, predatory grin. His teeth were jagged, yellow, and far too sharp for any human mouth. "I'm not Kev anymore," he rasped, his voice low and full of something sickening. "Not the man you knew. I've been changed." Anna took another step back, her heart hammering in her chest. This couldn't be real. Kev was dead, gone. He had disappeared years ago. But there he was, standing before her, or something like him, twisted beyond recognition. "What are you?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Kev, if it was Kev, took another step closer, his movements jerky and unnatural. His eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. "I was lost, but now I'm hungry." He licked his lips with a long, thin tongue, the sound making Anna's stomach churn. The Wendigo feeds on the hunger of men, Anna, and it never stops. It consumes, and it always wants more. Her heart raced as she stepped backward, her mind struggling to grasp what was happening. The Wendigo hadn't just taken Kev, it had turned him into something else. A monster, a twisted reflection of what he once was. "You're not human anymore," Anna whispered, her voice breaking as the reality of the situation settled in. Kev's smile grew wider, more grotesque. "Maybe not, but I'm still here. The Wendigo doesn't let you go. It takes you and leaves nothing behind but hunger." He leaned closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "It's in my blood now, in my veins, and it wants more." Before Anna could react, before she could run, he lunged. His movements were too fast, too unnatural. His hand shot out, grabbing her wrist with a vice-like grip, his fingers digging into her flesh like claws. She tried to pull away, but his strength was inhuman. His grip was unyielding, cold as death, and his eyes, those empty, soulless eyes, locked onto hers with a hunger that made her want to scream, to escape. But she couldn't move. Her body felt frozen, trapped by his unrelenting hold. She was caught, trapped by the Wendigo, and there was no escape. End of Chapter 4. The Return of Kev. This extended version of Chapter 4 delves deeper into the atmosphere of the woods and builds the tension between Anna and Kev's horrifying transformation. The presence of the Wendigo becomes undeniable, and Anna finds herself face to face with a twisted version of the person she once knew, leaving her no choice but to confront the terrifying reality of what Pine Hollow has become. The chapter intensifies the dread, heightening the horror that lurks in the woods and the danger that Anna now faces. Chapter 5. The Forgotten Ones. The air outside the inn felt as though it were pressing down on Anna, thick with the mist that rolled through the streets, choking the life from the very atmosphere. The fog had returned, swirling around her like a living, breathing entity, and though she knew the land was covered in the thick shroud of the night, this felt different, unnatural. Every corner she turned, every whisper of the wind in the trees seemed to be watching her, waiting. Anna had spent the entire day seeking answers, sifting through the town's library, questioning the wary townsfolk, and pushing herself further into the heart of Pine Hollow's haunted past. But no matter how hard she tried, the answers never felt close enough. Each piece of the puzzle seemed to push her further away, deeper into the mystery that the town wanted to keep buried. The truth, whatever it was, seemed so close, but it eluded her at every turn. She had uncovered fragments, hints of a history buried in darkness, but now, after her encounter with Kev, or what had been Kev, she could feel the pull of the Wendigo stronger than ever. The creature's hunger, its insatiable thirst for souls, had been awakened, and Pine Hollow had been feeding it for generations. Her breath fogged in the air as she walked, her footsteps muffled by the soft earth beneath her shoes. The town felt hollow, its streets eerily quiet. The buildings darkened as if in mourning. The gaslights cast weak halos of light on the empty streets, illuminating only a few feet in front of her before fading into the impenetrable dark. The fog had thickened again, swirling around her like a dense veil, distorting everything she saw. Anna couldn't shake the images of Kev's twisted face, the hunger in his eyes. The way he had moved, unnaturally fast, like something more than human, had shaken her to her core. It wasn't just the Wendigo that had claimed him. It had taken his very essence. She could see it now, in the way his voice had sounded, in the emptiness that had replaced everything she had known about him. He was a shell, a puppet to the Wendigo's curse. The hunger, the unending, gnawing hunger, it wasn't just in the creature, it was in the land. In the very town of Pine Hollow itself, the wind whispered through the trees, and Anna's skin prickled. The forest was alive with something that wasn't quite natural. The branches above her creaked and groaned, the sound like the scraping of bones against stone. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long, flickering and shifting, as if something was hiding just out of her sight, something waiting to consume her. She quickened her pace, her heart pounding against her ribs, as she made her way toward the old church on the edge of town. It had been abandoned for decades, but something about it called to her. It was as if the answers she had been seeking were hidden there, waiting for her to uncover them. She didn't know what she would find, but she knew she had to go. The church had been a place of sanctuary once, a place of worship, but now it was a monument to something darker, to the curse, to the Wendigo. The closer Anna got to the church, the heavier the air became. The fog seemed thicker here, clinging to the ground in dense, choking clouds. It was as though the forest was closing in around her, trapping her in its embrace. The church loomed ahead, its tall, Gothic spires cutting through the fog like blackened fingers reaching for the sky. The stone walls were crumbling, the stained glass windows shattered, but despite its ruin, it still held a kind of power. Anna hesitated at the entrance, her hand resting on the heavy wooden door. It creaked when she pushed it open, the sound echoing like a death knell in the silence. The air inside the church was damp and musty, the scent of mildew clinging to the walls. Dust floated in the weak light that filtered through the broken windows, casting the room in a dim, eerie glow. The silence was suffocating, as if the very air in this place had been trapped here for centuries, holding on to the dark secrets that had been hidden away. The inside of the church was even more decayed than the outside. The pews were broken, the altar covered in layers of dust and cobwebs. The floorboards creaked beneath Anna's feet as she walked further into the room, her every step sending dust motes swirling into the air. But it wasn't the dilapidated state of the church that caught her attention. It was the symbols. On the walls, etched into the stone, were markings she recognized. The same symbols she had seen in the journal from the library. They were scattered throughout the room, carved into the stone in ancient, winding patterns. But it was the larger symbol at the far end of the room, directly beneath the altar, that made Anna's blood run cold. It was a circle, surrounded by intricate lines and curves, forming a grotesque, almost unrecognizable shape. At the center of the circle was an empty, hollow symbol, a representation of the Wendigo, its emaciated body twisted into an unnatural, violent shape. Its eyes were empty, but the emptiness seemed to draw Anna in, to pull her deeper into its madness. As she stepped closer, Anna's mind seemed to slip, the world around her distorting. The hum from the ground, the same hum she had felt earlier, back at the inn, was louder now. The earth beneath her feet seemed to pulse with energy, vibrating with something primal, something alive. The pulse quickened, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stir, like something was moving just beyond her vision. Anna stumbled backward, her breath shallow, her pulse racing in her ears. The room felt smaller now, as though the walls were closing in, pressing her toward the symbol. And then, she heard it, the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing in the empty church. Anna froze. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until a figure emerged from the shadows near the altar. It was Robert, or what was left of him. His skin was pale, stretched tight over his bones, his body gaunt and skeletal. His eyes, once filled with life, were now empty voids, dark and hollow, devoid of anything human. His movements were jerky, unnatural, like a puppet whose strings had been pulled too tight. "You shouldn't be here," Robert rasped, his voice like gravel, barely human. "The Wendigo is waiting. It remembers you, Anna. It remembers all of us." Anna's heart raced, but she couldn't move, couldn't speak. She could only watch as Robert, no, the thing that had been Robert, stepped closer, his mouth twisting into something that could only be called a grin. "It remembers everyone who has ever fed it," he continued, his voice low and threatening. "Everyone who has ever been part of this town. And now, it's your turn." The hunger is inside you. It has already claimed you. It's only a matter of time. The air in the church thickened, suffocating Anna with the weight of the words, with the weight of what was about to happen. The pulse of the Wendigo's presence grew stronger, more insistent. She could feel it, deep inside, in the marrow of her bones. The hunger, the emptiness. Suddenly, the shadows began to move, swirling around her, pulling her toward Robert. She felt herself being drawn in, her feet unwillingly stepping forward, her legs heavy, as if they were no longer hers to control. The Wendigo's call was too strong. It was inside her now. It was too late. The room spun, the symbols on the wall seeming to shift and writhe, as though they were alive. The hum from the earth grew louder, and Anna could hear whispers, low, guttural voices, rising around her. "Join us," they whispered. "Join the hunger." Anna's vision blurred, her mind spinning with the weight of the curse, with the terrible knowledge that the Wendigo was not just a creature. It was a part of the town, a part of her now. It was waiting to claim her, to take her soul, to feed on her. And as the shadows closed in around her, she felt a terrible clarity. The Wendigo wasn't just hunting. It had been feeding on Pine Hollow for generations. And now, it would feed on her too. Bajti. End of Chapter 5. The Forgotten Ones. This expanded chapter delves deeper into the dark history of Pine Hollow, revealing the terrifying origins of the Wendigo and its insidious grip on the town. Anna's encounter with Robert, now a twisted version of himself, escalates the tension as the Wendigo's influence spreads, claiming more souls in its wake. The final revelation, that the Wendigo's hunger is not only for flesh but for the very souls of the town's inhabitants, pushes Anna closer to her breaking point. The chapter ends on a note of overwhelming dread, as Anna realizes the curse has already begun to claim her. Chapter 6. The Wendigo's Embrace. The night had fallen thick and suffocating, its cold tendrils reaching deep into Anna's bones as she stumbled out of the church. Her mind was a whirlwind of fragmented thoughts, and yet, despite the chaos swirling in her head, there was one undeniable feeling that settled deep in her chest: the hunger. It gnawed at her insides like a cold, invisible hand, twisting her stomach into knots. The hunger was here, and it wasn't just in the church, it was inside her now. Anna could feel the weight of the Wendigo's presence, a suffocating shadow that clung to her every move, pressing down on her with a pressure she couldn't shake. The fog outside seemed to deepen as she made her way back to the streets, its dense embrace wrapping around her like a living thing. The town of Pine Hollow had fallen into an unnatural stillness. It was as though the world itself had paused, holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. The moon was obscured by thick clouds, casting the streets into an inky darkness. The only sounds were the faint rustling of the trees and the occasional creak of wood groaning under the weight of the mist. Anna felt as though she were moving through a dream. No, a nightmare, where nothing was real, and everything was shifting, warping in ways she couldn't understand. Her footsteps echoed down the empty streets, but the more she walked, the more she felt something was wrong. The town, once so full of whispers and silent judgment, now felt entirely deserted, as if it had been abandoned, left to rot under the weight of its curse. The few houses that lined the streets had their windows shut tight, their lights flickering weakly behind the curtains. But there was no life here, no movement. She stopped in her tracks, her breath catching in her throat. From the corner of her eye, she saw movement, something out of place. The figure was barely a shadow, moving through the fog with a grace that was unnatural. Anna's heart leapt into her throat and she turned quickly, her senses on high alert. The street ahead of her was empty. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but her legs felt heavy, as though the fog had reached inside her and was now weighing her down. The hunger. She could feel it, pulsing through her veins, crawling through her chest. It was inside her now, the thing she had been warned about. The Wendigo wasn't just a creature in the woods anymore. It had invaded Pine Hollow. It had claimed the town, and worse, it had claimed her. A sick, gnawing dread wrapped around her like a vice. She didn't know what to do anymore. She felt as though she were losing control, as if the town, the curse, were swallowing her whole. The cold fog crept into her lungs, making it hard to breathe, hard to think. She pressed her palm against the nearest building, trying to steady herself. But the moment her hand touched the wood, She felt it. A pulse. A rhythm. Slow. Steady. Familiar. The Wendigo. She staggered back, her mind reeling. The pulsing feeling was the same as it had been inside the church, vibrating through the floorboards, through the walls. It wasn't just a creature. It wasn't something that could be destroyed. It was a force, a curse woven into the very fabric of the town. The hunger was growing stronger. Anna's eyes darted around, panic rising in her chest. She had to get away. She had to leave. But the fog, no, the town, was closing in on her. The streets were twisting, stretching, and every corner she turned seemed to lead her deeper into the grip of something she could no longer escape. She turned back toward the church, her steps quickening as a primal instinct took over. Her hand clenched around the key to her room at the inn, but she didn't feel safe. Nothing felt safe anymore. As she neared the church, the cold wind picked up, swirling around her like a wraith, whispering her name. The sound was faint, like a voice carried on the wind, but it was enough to freeze her blood. She stumbled toward the door, pulling at the handle, but the door wouldn't open. She tried again, desperately, but it was as though something inside was blocking her way. The wind screamed louder, and for the first time, Anna realized the church wasn't empty. Something was inside, watching her. With a final desperate push, the door creaked open. A cold gust of wind rushed past her, carrying with it the sharp scent of earth and decay. The air was different inside, heavier, as if the weight of the past had settled into the very floorboards, filling the room with a thick, suffocating presence. Anna stepped inside, but she immediately regretted it. The hum, the sound. It was louder now, filling her chest, vibrating through her very bones. It was as if the church was alive, breathing in time with the pulse of the Wendigo. The walls seemed to sway slightly, as though they too were pulsing with the creature's hunger. She took a step forward, her mind racing, but before she could process what was happening, the shadows in the corner of the room shifted. They moved like smoke, gathering in the space near the altar, and then it stepped forward. It was Robert, or at least what had been Robert. His skin was stretched tight over his bones, pale as death, and his eyes, those hollow, empty sockets, gazed at her with a hunger so deep it seemed to pierce her soul. He moved toward her with unnerving speed, his joints cracking as he took each step, his limbs jerking as though his body no longer obeyed the laws of nature. "Anna," Robert rasped, his voice low and full of an unnatural echo. "You shouldn't have come back. You shouldn't have disturbed it." Anna's heart thundered in her chest as she stumbled backward, her pulse quickening. She couldn't breathe. The hunger. She felt it, rising inside her like a tidal wave, an insatiable force clawing at her from the inside. Robert's smile, if you could even call it a smile, twisted, his teeth now sharp and jagged, gleaming in the dim light. "It's too late for you," he whispered, his voice low, like a snake's hiss. "You're already part of it. The Wendigo has claimed you." Anna's hands went numb as she tried to back away, but her legs felt weak. The hunger was in her now. It was suffocating, pulling her in, drawing her closer to him, to the Wendigo, to the curse that had consumed Pine Hollow. And then, just as Robert lunged toward her, the shadows in the church thickened, swirling around Anna like a cloak. She could feel them tugging at her, pulling her toward the altar where the Wendigo's curse had begun. The walls seemed to breathe, and in her mind, she could hear the voices, the whispers of the forgotten, the lost souls who had been claimed before her. The hunger. The hunger was inside her now. She couldn't escape. As the darkness closed in around her, Anna let out a blood-curdling scream, but no sound came out. Only the deafening hum of the Wendigo's presence filled her ears. And in that moment, she realized she was no longer Anna Rivers. She was part of it, part of the Wendigo's hunger. End of chapter 6. The Wendigo's embrace. This expanded chapter takes Anna deeper into the heart of the town's curse, as the presence of the Wendigo consumes her with each step she takes. Her encounter with Robert, now a twisted shell of his former self, escalates the tension, leaving Anna trapped in the church, surrounded by the very hunger she has been trying to escape. The chapter closes with Anna realizing the full extent of the Wendigo's influence over Pine Hollow, and over her own fate. Chapter 7. The Darth's Curse. The forest was not what it seemed. Anna's feet felt heavy as she moved deeper into the woods, the very earth beneath her seeming to resist her every step. The trees around her grew thicker, their gnarled branches twisting into unnatural shapes, casting long, spider-like shadows across her path. The air had grown colder, a biting chill that sunk deep into her skin, creeping through the layers of her coat. But it wasn't the cold that unnerved her. It was the silence. The silence of the woods was oppressive, suffocating, like the air was thick with secrets and things best left forgotten. She couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was alive, watching her, listening to her every move. The ground beneath her feet felt as though it were shifting, the soil soft and damp, sucking at her boots with every step. The fog had become a constant companion, swirling around her in tendrils, making it difficult to see even a few feet ahead. Each step took her further from the safety of the town and deeper into the heart of something ancient, something evil. Pine Hollow had always been a place of unease, but out here, in the woods, it was as if the town's history had come to life, its dark past reaching out from the earth to claim her. Anna had been in forests before, but this felt different. There was a malevolent energy here, a sense of being drawn into something beyond her understanding. She had no idea what she was walking into, but she knew one thing. There was no turning back now. The whispers of the Darth, the terrible hunger that had haunted the town for generations, were impossible to ignore. Every warning she had received, every cryptic phrase, had been leading her to this moment. She could feel it, the Darth, waiting, watching, its presence more oppressive with each step. Elaine's words echoed in her mind. The Wendigo doesn't just take, it makes you crave it, even if you know it's wrong. It takes your soul and leaves only hunger behind. It was a curse, a cycle that had been passed down through the generations, consuming everything in its path. Pine Hollow wasn't just a town, it was a vessel, a breeding ground for this ancient evil, and Anna had walked right into its grasp. The wind began to pick up again, the trees groaning in the distance as though they were sighing with the weight of the world. The sound was low at first, a distant rumble, but it quickly grew louder, more urgent. Anna felt the hair on the back of her neck stand up as the forest seemed to speak. The rustling of the leaves became more distinct, more purposeful, like voices whispering just out of her reach. The words were indecipherable, but they were there, and the more she strained to listen, the louder they became. Come closer. Listen. You're almost there. She stopped in her tracks, her pulse racing. There was something ahead, something waiting for her in the depths of the woods. Her breath hitched, and for a moment she wanted to turn back, to flee back to the safety of the town. But then, like an invisible hand, the forest reached out to pull her forward, urging her to go on, to confront whatever lay ahead. Taking a deep breath, Anna forced herself to move. Each step was a battle, her mind screaming at her to turn back, but her feet moving forward despite her instincts. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, and she could feel something stirring in the air, something ancient, hungry. It was getting closer. Suddenly, the ground before her shifted, the earth breaking apart in a way that made her stomach turn. A deep crack formed in the ground, a jagged line that seemed to stretch for miles, dividing the forest like a wound. As Anna approached the edge, she could see movement within the crack, shadows shifting, twitching, as though something was emerging from below. She recoiled, her breath catching in her throat, but something inside her, the pull of the Darth, the hunger, compelled her forward. She stepped closer to the edge, her heart pounding in her chest as she peered into the crack. It was like looking into the mouth of a cave, a dark, suffocating void that seemed to go on forever. But then she saw it. Them. Figures, shadows, distorted shapes that writhed and twisted in the dark, their forms shifting in ways that made her stomach churn. They were not human, not anymore. Their faces were gaunt, twisted, hollowed-out masks of pain and hunger. Their bodies were twisted, elongated, their limbs jerking unnaturally as they clawed their way out of the abyss. Anna stumbled back, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she turned to flee. But the ground beneath her feet seemed to shift again, the earth sinking, pulling her deeper into the crack. She fought against it, but her legs were numb, her body heavy with fear. And then, before she could react, a hand shot up from the depths, grabbing her ankle with inhuman strength. She screamed, her voice swallowed by the howling wind, but it was too late. The creature's grip tightened, pulling her toward the crack. She tried to claw her way free, but the shadows had already surrounded her, their fingers cold and unyielding. She was being dragged toward the void, toward whatever horrors lay beneath the earth. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the ground released her. She tumbled backward, landing hard on the ground with a sickening thud. Her head spun, her vision blurry, and for a moment, she thought she might lose consciousness. But she couldn't afford to pass out. Not now. She forced herself to sit up, her chest heaving with the effort, and looked around frantically. The shadows had retreated, fading back into the crack from which they had emerged. The forest was still, silent again, but Anna knew better than to trust it. The forest knew she was here. It had been waiting for her, watching her, drawing her into its depths. The Dath's presence was undeniable now, its grip on her tightening like a noose around her throat. She forced herself to stand, her legs unsteady, but she couldn't stop now. She had to find out what was waiting for her in the heart of the forest. She had to understand what was calling her. The fog had thickened, wrapping around her like a blanket, and as she stumbled deeper into the woods, the trees seemed to close in on her. The air grew even colder, a biting chill that seemed to freeze her very breath. She could feel the weight of the darkness pressing down on her, and with every step, the forest seemed to get darker, the shadows deeper. The path ahead was obscured, lost in the fog, but something in her gut told her to keep going, to move forward. It wasn't until she reached a clearing that she finally stopped. The moon was high in the sky now, its pale light casting long shadows across the ground. The trees in this part of the forest were twisted, their trunks gnarled and bent at unnatural angles. But what caught Anna's attention wasn't the trees. It was what stood at the center of the clearing, a figure, tall, cloaked in shadows, standing perfectly still, like a statue. At first, Anna thought it might be another of the twisted creatures from the crack, but as she stepped closer, her breath catching in her throat, she realized this was something different. It was human, or at least it had been once. But now, its skin was pale, stretched tight over its bones, its eyes hollow and black, like voids that consumed everything around them. It was tall, too tall, and its limbs were unnaturally long, its hands twitching in a way that made Anna's skin crawl. The figure didn't move as Anna stepped closer, its head turning slowly toward her, its hollow eyes locking onto hers. She could feel its gaze, cold, penetrating, and it made her stomach twist. She had no idea who or what this was, but she knew deep in her gut that it was part of the Dath, part of the curse that had consumed Pine Hollow for centuries. "You shouldn't have come," the figure whispered, its voice like dry leaves scraping against stone. It was a voice Anna recognized, though she couldn't place it. It was familiar, yet wrong, twisted. The figure took a step toward her, its limbs jerking unnaturally, and Anna stumbled back, fear flooding her chest. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice shaking, but the figure did not answer. It merely moved closer, its hollow eyes never leaving hers, its smile, if you could even call it that, wide and sickening. And then it spoke again. "You're here to understand, but you don't know what you're dealing with. The hunger will claim you, just as it claimed them, just as it claimed me." The words hit Anna like a physical blow. The hunger. The Dath. It was all real, all a part of Pine Hollow's curse, and it was reaching out to her, pulling her in. There was no escape. "No," she whispered, though she didn't know if she was trying to convince the figure or herself. She had come too far to turn back. She had to see this through. She had to uncover the truth. But the figure's smile only widened, its eyes darkening, and the last thing Anna saw before the world around her went black was the figure's outstretched hand. Chai, end of chapter 7. The Dath's Curse. In this expanded chapter, Anna's journey through the forest and her encounter with the Dath takes on a deeper, more sinister tone. The forest itself seems alive, pulling Anna further into its depths, and the figure she encounters is a manifestation of the curse that has consumed Pine Hollow for centuries. The chapter builds toward a terrifying climax, leaving Anna and the reader clinging to the edge of horror, unsure of what will come next. The Dath's power is undeniable, and Anna is no longer just a passive observer. She is being pulled deeper into the very heart of its hunger. Chapter 8. The Descent into Madness. The darkness pressed against Anna from all sides, suffocating her, wrapping around her like a blanket woven from fear and despair. Every step she took seemed to drag her deeper into the void. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her chest rising and falling as if she were struggling to stay afloat in a sea of shadows. The hunger was in her now, worse than before, stronger, more insistent. It was inside her, clawing at her, digging its claws into her soul. Anna could feel the weight of the curse settling deep within her, its icy fingers closing around her heart, her mind. She had thought she understood the horror of Pine Hollow, thought she had glimpsed the truth, but now, in the oppressive silence of the church, she understood just how far gone the town had become, and how much further she had fallen. Her body felt heavy, as though it were no longer her own. The walls of the church loomed over her, their once solid structure now twisted and bent under the pressure of the Dath's curse. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to shift, creeping in on her, as if the very space she stood in was alive, breathing, feeding off her fear. The hunger, that gnawing emptiness inside her, pulsed in time with her heartbeat. It was deep, primal, a feeling that tore at her insides, pulling her towards something she didn't want to face but knew was inevitable. The hunger had her in its grip now, like a vice, tightening around her thoughts, her very soul, and it wanted more. The room seemed to grow colder with every passing moment, the temperature dropping so quickly that Anna could see her breath in the air. The oppressive cold settled deep in her bones, and she felt the weight of it, the chill that went beyond physical temperature and dug deep into her soul. It was as though the very walls of the church had frozen, trapping her in a place where time no longer existed. Everything here was stagnant, decaying, waiting for the final fall. In the distance, a faint whisper echoed through the church, a low guttural sound that seemed to vibrate the very air around her. It came from the shadows, from the altar. Anna's eyes were drawn to it, even though she didn't want to look. She could feel the pull, an invisible force drawing her toward the source of the sound, just as the Dath had pulled her into its embrace. Her feet moved before her mind could process the decision, as if they had already made up their minds for her. She stumbled forward, feeling the coldness in the stone beneath her shoes. The air around her grew thicker with each step, the hum of the Dath's presence rising louder, vibrating through her skin, her blood. Her heartbeat quickened, her breath shallow, as though her lungs could no longer hold the air she needed. "You are mine," the voice whispered again, this time clearer. "You belong to the hunger. You belong to me." Anna tried to resist. She tried to pull herself away from the altar, from the shadows, but her body refused to listen. The hunger inside her was too powerful, too overwhelming. She could feel it clawing at her from the inside, begging for release. Her mind raced as she fought against the overwhelming desire to give in. She had to fight. She had to resist. There had to be some part of her left, some trace of the woman who had come to Pine Hollow, seeking answers. But every part of her screamed to stop fighting. Every part of her wanted to let go. "Don't fight it," the voice came again, this time directly in her mind. "Embrace the hunger. Let it consume you. It is your destiny." The shadows in the room thickened, swirling around her like a storm, a whirlpool of darkness that seemed to close in on her from every direction. The walls seemed to stretch away from her, the space around her warping as if reality itself was bending to the will of the Dath. She could feel it, its presence, its power. It was inside her now, feeding on her thoughts, on her fear. Anna tried to scream, but no sound escaped. Her throat felt dry, tight, as though the Dath had already begun to close off her ability to speak, to express herself. She tried to move, to escape, but the hunger was too strong, too overwhelming. It was in her now, binding her to the Dath, just as it had bound Pine Hollow for centuries. She could feel her mind slipping, unraveling like a thread being pulled from a tapestry. The hunger was taking her, taking everything, her identity, her will, her very soul. It was feeding on her, turning her into something else, something less. It was a part of her now, just as it had been a part of the town, a part of the curse that had claimed everyone in Pine Hollow before her. "You belong to me," the voice repeated, its tone soft, soothing, like a lullaby. "The hunger has always been in you. It was never a choice. You were always meant to feed it." Anna's legs gave way beneath her, and she collapsed to the cold stone floor, her hands trembling at her sides. She could feel the hunger rising inside her like a tide, a roaring, endless wave that was washing away everything she had ever been. Her thoughts were no longer her own. They were consumed by the death, consumed by the hunger, consumed by the curse that had claimed her body, her mind, her soul. The walls seemed to close in, suffocating her, but she no longer cared. There was no resistance left in her. She was nothing but a vessel for the hunger now. It had consumed her completely, and then she felt it, something shifting inside her. It was small at first, a subtle pull, like the tug of a string, but it grew stronger, more insistent. She could feel it, the death, moving through her, twisting inside her, seizing control of her body. Anna's body was no longer her own. Her vision blurred as the hunger swept through her, clouding her mind, filling her with an emptiness that only grew larger. The shadows that had surrounded her began to swirl around her like a whirlpool, pulling her into their depths. The death had taken her completely, and as the darkness enveloped her, she realized the terrible truth. She had become the hunger. The shadows around her began to shift and change, and Anna realized they weren't just shadows. They were the remnants of the lost souls, the ones the death had claimed before her. Their forms flickered in and out of existence, like ghosts trapped between the worlds, bound by the hunger that had been passed down through the generations. Anna's hands reached out involuntarily, her fingers brushing against the shadows. The moment her skin made contact with them, the world around her seemed to freeze. Her vision narrowed, and she felt herself slipping into something far darker, far more terrible. She could see their faces, twisted, distorted faces of people who had once lived in Pine Hollow, people who had fallen to the curse long before her. They were all around her now, whispering, their voices filled with despair and hunger. "You are one of us now. You are part of the hunger." Anna could feel herself slipping away, her humanity fading with each passing second, replaced by something much darker, much older. She could hear the voice of the death in her mind, its whispers like a lullaby, pulling her into the depths of madness. "Embrace it," it whispered. "You are one of us now. You are part of the hunger." As the darkness closed in, Anna felt the final shred of her will slip away. She was no longer Anna Rivers. She was a part of the curse, a part of the hunger. The hunger had claimed her, and Pine Hollow would never be free. For some. End of chapter 8. The descent into madness. In this chapter, Anna fully succumbs to the death's curse, realizing that she has become part of the hunger that has plagued Pine Hollow for generations. The realization of being consumed by the death, a force older and more insidious than the Wendigo, overwhelms her, and she is left trapped within the curse. The chapter reveals the true nature of the hunger, as Anna is pulled deeper into madness and darkness, unable to escape the power that has claimed her. Chapter 9. The Whispering Shadows. The air inside the church was oppressive, the atmosphere thick with the weight of something ancient, something far older than the building itself. Anna stood at the threshold, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she surveyed the dim interior. The faint light from the fog outside barely penetrated the stained glass windows, casting fractured rays of color across the dusty pews and worn altar. The scent of mildew and decay filled her nostrils, mingling with the faintest trace of something else, something darker, more insidious. The smell of rot, of death. The death was here. She could feel it, coiling in the corners of the church like a serpent, its presence so overwhelming that it seemed to choke the very life out of the room. She wasn't sure how she had known it, but she had. The whispers had been constant in the back of her mind, ever since she had set foot in Pine Hollow, growing louder with every passing hour, every step she took deeper into the mystery of the town. They spoke of hunger, of darkness, of souls lost to the curse that had claimed the town for centuries. They spoke of her, and now, as Anna stood at the precipice of the church's dark history, she realized with a sickening clarity that she was no longer just investigating the horrors of Pine Hollow. She was a part of them. She had crossed a threshold, and there was no turning back. She stepped inside, the door creaking ominously behind her. The silence was suffocating, pressing down on her like a physical weight. Her footsteps echoed in the empty space, distorted and hollow, as though the church itself was absorbing them, swallowing them into the void. The shadows seemed to stretch in every direction, moving with a life of their own, flickering and twisting as though they were alive. The pulpit loomed at the far end of the room, its wooden surface worn with age and neglect. The altar beneath the pulpit was surrounded by symbols Anna had seen before, scratched into the walls of the town's buildings, etched into the very foundation of Pine Hollow. The symbols were ancient, archaic, a language Anna couldn't begin to understand, but she knew that they were tied to the curse, to the Darth. They marked the boundaries of the town's dark history, the boundaries of the evil that had bled into its very soul. Her heart beat faster as she moved toward the altar, the air growing heavier with each step. The closer she got, the more she felt the presence of the Darth pressing in on her. It was watching her, its hunger palpable, its cold breath like a gust of wind brushing the back of her neck. She tried to swallow the lump in her throat, but it refused to go down. She was standing on the edge of something terrible, something vast and unknowable. And yet, despite the terror that gripped her, she couldn't stop. She had come this far. She had to know the truth. As Anna reached the altar, her eyes flicked to the symbols once more, their jagged lines seeming to pulse with a malevolent energy. She could feel them calling to her, tugging at the very core of her being, urging her to understand, to uncover the secrets they hid. She reached out a hand, hesitant at first, but then with more certainty, and traced the edge of one of the symbols. The moment her fingers touched the cold stone, the air in the room shifted. The walls seemed to groan in response, as though they were awakening from a long slumber. And then the whispers began. "You shouldn't have come." The voice was low, distant, yet unmistakable. It was the Darth's voice, threaded through the very fabric of the room, reverberating through the stone and the shadows. Anna's breath caught in her throat as she looked around, searching for the source. But there was nothing, only the empty space of the church, the pulpit, the altar. Yet she knew that something was there, something watching her from the darkness, something ancient. "You are mine now." The voice was louder this time, a deep, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate through her very soul. It was cold, unfeeling, like the echo of something long forgotten. "You have opened the door. There is no escape." Anna felt a sharp pang in her chest, a sudden pressure that made it hard to breathe. The hunger was here, coursing through the walls, through the floor, through her veins. She staggered backward, her legs giving out beneath her, but the weight of the presence of the Darth held her in place. She couldn't move. She couldn't escape. The shadows pressed in around her, thick and suffocating, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. "You are part of the hunger now. The hunger will claim you." The words echoed in her mind, over and over again, drowning out everything else. Anna struggled to stay conscious, to stay grounded in the reality she once knew, but it was slipping away from her, like sand through her fingers. She could feel the Darth's influence seeping into her mind, worming its way into her thoughts, her soul. It wanted to consume her. It wanted to claim her, but she wouldn't let it. With every ounce of strength she could muster, Anna forced herself to her feet, her hands shaking as she pressed them against the altar. She had come here to uncover the truth, to understand the curse that had plagued Pine Hollow for generations. She wasn't going to let the Darth stop her, not now, not after everything she had learned, after everything she had sacrificed to get this far. The room seemed to pulse with energy, the very air thick with the Darth's power. But Anna pushed against it. She had to resist. She had to fight. "You cannot fight me." The voice was a cold whisper, a mocking hiss that reverberated through her skull. "You are already part of me. There is no escape from the hunger." But Anna refused to listen. She focused all of her energy on the symbols, on the history they represented. She had read about the curse, the hunger, but now she needed to understand it, not just intellectually, but physically, in the deepest part of her being. The Dath's power was ancient, yes, but it wasn't invincible. The hunger had consumed everything around her, but it hadn't consumed her. Not yet. "You are nothing," the Dath growled, its voice a low rumble of fury. "You are just another sacrifice in a long line of sacrifices. You cannot fight what has always been." Anna closed her eyes, willing herself to block out the voice, to block out the darkness that surrounded her. She focused on the symbols, on their meaning, on their connection to the curse. She could feel them, pulling at her, asking her to understand. "It's too late for you." The Dath's voice was softer now, but there was an edge to it, a growing frustration that Anna could sense, even if she couldn't see it. "You can't stop it. The hunger will claim you, just like it claimed all the others." But Anna wasn't listening. The hunger, the Dath, the curse, they were all part of a cycle that had been repeated over and over again in Pine Hollow. The Dath had fed on the people of the town for centuries, and it had consumed everything in its path. But cycles could be broken. She could break this cycle. With a sudden surge of willpower, Anna reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the small knife she had brought with her. The blade gleamed in the dim light, its edge sharp and unforgiving. She had no idea how it would work, but she had to try. She had to break the curse, break the hunger. It was the only way. With trembling hands, she pressed the blade to her palm. The pain was sharp, immediate, but Anna didn't flinch. She let the blood flow, feeling it trickle down her wrist as she placed her palm flat against the symbols on the altar. The moment her blood touched the stone, the room shuddered, a deep, resonating tremor that rattled the walls and shook the ground beneath her feet. The Dath's voice faltered, the whispers quieting, as if the very act of Anna's blood touching the altar was disrupting something ancient. "What are you doing?" The voice was low, panicked. "You cannot." But it was too late. The power that had held Pine Hollow in its grip for so long began to unravel, like a thread being pulled from the fabric of the world. The shadows writhed in agony, the walls groaning as if they, too, were trying to escape. Anna felt the Dath's power receding, its hunger fading just a little, as if it were losing its grip on the town. On her, the hunger would be broken. She would break the cycle. The room fell silent, the oppressive weight lifting, if only slightly. Anna's chest heaved as she wiped the blood from her hand, her heart still pounding in her ears. She had done it. She had taken the first step in breaking the Dath's curse, but she knew this was only the beginning. The Dath would fight back. The hunger would not give up so easily. Chapter 9. The Final Sacrifice. Anna's breath came in shallow gasps as she stood on the edge of the ancient stone circle, her fingers trembling against the worn, weathered symbols carved into the stones beneath her feet. The night was thick with fog, the moonlight barely piercing the veil of mist that clung to the trees, giving the forest an otherworldly glow. She had always believed in logic, in facts. Everything had a cause, an explanation. But as the ritual progressed, as the hunger of the Wendigo grew nearer, Anna felt the very foundation of her beliefs crumbling beneath her. She had come to Pine Hollow seeking answers, seeking truth, but in the end, the truth had proven far darker than she had ever imagined. The Wendigo was no mere legend, no mythical creature of the wilds. It was a curse, a hunger that fed on the darkest parts of human nature, feeding on greed, desperation, and consumption. It was alive in the town's very bones, its presence tied to every whispered story, every missing person, every broken family. And now, Anna was at the center of it all. The town of Pine Hollow, its people, its history, were bound to the Wendigo's curse, and Anna realized with a cold clarity that the only way to break that curse, to stop the creature once and for all, was to offer herself as the final sacrifice. Her blood, her life, would be the key to ending the cycle of hunger that had claimed so many. The thought made her stomach twist, a sharp, hollow ache forming at the pit of her stomach. But there was no other choice. The Wendigo's voice had been constant in her mind, urging her to give in, to embrace the hunger that it had instilled in her. But Anna resisted. The hunger had always been present, but it had never fully consumed her. Not like the others, not like Robert, not like Kev. Anna's thoughts turned back to Robert, and she felt a deep sorrow well up inside her. Robert had once been a kind, troubled man, but the Wendigo had claimed him long ago. It had taken his soul, twisted him into something else, and now he was little more than a puppet, his body a vessel for the creature's insatiable hunger. She had hoped at one point that there was still something left of him inside, some shred of humanity, but now she knew the truth. There was nothing left. The Wendigo had claimed him fully, and in the end he had tried to use her as a vessel for its dark purpose. But Anna had resisted, and now Kev, what was left of Kev, was standing before her, his twisted form barely recognizable. His body was a grotesque parody of what he had once been, his eyes hollow and dark, his skin pale and stretched tight over his bones. The hunger was in him, coursing through his veins, and Anna could see it, the thing that had once been her friend, her companion, now consumed by the Wendigo's insatiable need. Kev was no longer the man she had known. He was something else, something monstrous. Her pulse quickened as she looked into his empty eyes, seeing the familiar face, but also seeing something much darker beneath the surface. She could feel the weight of his stare, the pull of his presence, and for a moment, she wondered if he even recognized her anymore. "Kev," she whispered, her voice trembling. "What happened to you?" The figure that had once been her friend tilted its head, a sickening grin spreading across its face. "I am not Kev anymore," it rasped, its voice like dry leaves scraping against stone. "Not the man you knew. I have been changed." Her heart broke at the words, and for a fleeting moment, she thought she could hear the real Kev buried beneath the creature's voice. The Wendigo had taken him, twisted him into this thing that now stood before her, but there had to be something left. Something human. "Please!" Anna's voice cracked, the tears welling in her eyes as she stepped closer, reaching out a hand. "Kev, I know you're still in there. I know you can hear me. You have to fight it. You have to—" "I can't," Kev interrupted, his voice cutting through her desperate plea like a blade. "I am beyond saving. The hunger is inside me, Anna. It consumes me, and it will consume you too. You can't fight it. You can't stop it. The Wendigo is all that remains." His grin widened, and his eyes gleamed with a terrible hunger. "You should have left Pine Hollow when you had the chance. Now you are mine." Anna recoiled, taking a step back. The air around her seemed to grow heavier, the ground beneath her feet sinking into the earth, as though the town itself were pulling her deeper into its grip. The Wendigo was here, inside Kev, inside Robert, inside the very walls of Pine Hollow. It had always been here, and now it was reaching for her. Her mind raced, trying to find a way out, but the answer came to her with a sickening clarity. There was no escape. There was no running away from this. She was already in the forest, already in the curse. The only way to end it, to end the hunger, was to confront it head-on. "I'm not like you," Anna said, her voice steadying as she found her resolve. "I won't give in to the hunger. I won't be part of the curse. I refuse to be another sacrifice for the Wendigo's twisted appetite." Kev's grin faltered for a brief moment, and for the first time, Anna saw something flicker in his eyes. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there, a glimmer of the man he had once been. And then it was gone. "You think you can resist it?" Kev rasped, stepping closer. "The Wendigo is a part of you now. It has been since you first stepped into the town, since you first smelled its hunger. You think you can stop it? You think you can stop me?" Anna swallowed hard, her hands shaking as she reached for the small ancient artifact she had found earlier, the piece of the ritual that had been left behind in the town's ruins. It was a talisman, an object imbued with the power to banish the Wendigo, to break the curse once and for all. But it required something more than just willpower. It required a sacrifice. Her heart raced as she realized the final truth. It wasn't just her blood that would end the curse. It was her life. She had come too far to back out now. The only way to destroy the Wendigo, to sever its hold on Pine Hollow, was to offer herself completely to the hunger, to become the sacrifice. Her thoughts turned to Robert, to Kev, to the town. She had to do this, not just for herself, but for all of them. She couldn't let this evil consume any more innocent lives. She would be the one to end it. With a deep, steadying breath, Anna stepped forward, holding the talisman out in front of her. The air around her crackled with energy, the shadows retreating as the ancient magic began to pulse through the stone in her hand. Kev, or the Wendigo that had once been him, recoiled, hissing as the light from the talisman grew brighter. "No!" the creature howled, its body convulsing, its once human face twisting in pain. "You cannot stop it! You are mine! You are already—" But Anna didn't wait. She thrust the talisman toward the Wendigo, her voice rising in a chant she didn't fully understand. But that felt right, as though it had been buried deep inside her all along. The power of the talisman surged through her, a wave of energy that surged through her veins like wildfire. And with a final deafening cry, the Wendigo collapsed. The shadows that had swarmed the church seemed to disintegrate, fading into the light as the creature howled in agony. The talisman pulsed one final time, and then, with a flash of light so bright it seared Anna's vision, the Wendigo collapsed. The hunger that had consumed Pine Hollow for generations was gone, its grip severed. But Anna was not unscathed. The energy from the ritual had drained her, leaving her weak, her body trembling. She could feel herself slipping, her vision growing blurry as she fell to her knees, the weight of the sacrifice pressing down on her like a physical force. And then, through the haze of her fading consciousness, she heard a voice. "Anna!" Her heart leaped in her chest. Kev. But it wasn't the Wendigo's voice. It was his, the real Kev. The one who had been lost. The one who had fought to break free. "Anna, you did it!" Kev whispered, his voice so faint, so distant. "You broke the cycle. You saved us all." With that, the world around her went black. Chapter 10. The Last Breath of Pine Hollow. The world around Anna had gone utterly still. The silence in the church was suffocating, a thick, unnatural quiet that seemed to press against her ears, forcing the air from her lungs. Her hands were cold and clammy, sweat beading on her brow despite the biting chill that had settled into the walls. Her heart raced in her chest, each beat reverberating through her ribcage, but the dread that had gripped her soul was much louder. It drowned out the sound of her breath, of the slow rhythm of her pulse. She was alone, but she was not alone. The hunger was everywhere. It was in the walls, in the very stone beneath her feet. It was in the air, a faint, insidious pulse that seemed to breathe alongside her. It was inside her, crawling beneath her skin, gnawing at her, feeding on her fear, her pain. It had been with her since she stepped foot into Pine Hollow, an invisible weight that had settled on her heart, growing heavier with each step she took, until now, when she felt as though it would crush her. Anna's body trembled, her fingers twitching as the urge to claw at her skin gripped her, the hunger making her feel like a prisoner in her own body. Her mind screamed for release, but the hunger, the death, had already taken root. It was no longer just an external force. It was part of her, like a second heartbeat, a second mind. The Darth had been feeding on the souls of Pine Hollow for generations, twisting the town into something twisted, a dark reflection of the world outside. And now it had claimed her, just as it had claimed all those who had come before her. "I won't give in," Anna whispered to herself, though the words sounded hollow, swallowed by the immense weight of the curse. She tried to steady herself, to center her mind, but the hunger was too overwhelming. She could feel it, scratching at her insides, filling her thoughts with images of emptiness, of devouring, of becoming the very thing she feared most. In the center of the church, the altar loomed before her like a dark monument to the Dath's insatiable hunger. The space around it seemed warped, as though reality itself was bending in on itself, the shadows reaching out for her, their fingers curling around her thoughts. The walls of the church stretched and contracted, as though the building itself was alive, breathing, pulsing with the same rhythm as the Dath. "You can't escape it," the Dath's voice echoed through her mind, a low, guttural whisper that sounded like the rustle of ancient leaves. It vibrated in her skull, pressing in on her from every direction. "It has already claimed you. The hunger is inside you. You belong to me now." Anna's vision swam, her head spinning as she stumbled backward, her body trying to flee from the crushing weight of the Dath's presence. The hunger, the darkness, it was so overwhelming that she couldn't separate the two. It felt like the very air was suffocating her, the walls closing in, the floor tilting beneath her feet. But then something shifted. A whisper, soft, gentle, but unmistakable. "Anna, you must fight." It was Robert's voice. His name echoed in her mind, a flicker of something familiar, something human, breaking through the fog of darkness. She turned, her body moving on instinct, following the faint sound of his voice. But the shadows were thick, crawling across the floor like black smoke, wrapping themselves around her legs, pulling her down into the abyss. "Robert," she gasped, her voice hoarse, barely audible above the hum of the Dath's presence. She took a step forward, but the shadows seemed to close in on her, pushing her back. She could feel them wrapping around her body, pressing against her skin, suffocating her, drowning her in their weight. The hunger rose within her again, demanding release, and Anna's body trembled in response. She could almost taste it now, taste the hunger that threatened to consume her, that was consuming her. And yet she fought. She fought with everything she had left. "Robert!" she called again, her voice rising in desperation. There was a flicker in the darkness, a shape moving in the distance. Her breath caught in her throat as she strained her eyes, trying to focus. The shadows seemed to shift, parts of them breaking away, fading into nothing. And then, there, he was. Robert. He stood before her, but he wasn't the Robert she remembered. His face was gaunt. His skin stretched over his bones, pale and drawn. His eyes hollow voids, where his once lively gaze had been. His lips parted, but the words that came from him were not his own. "I'm sorry, Anna." His voice was weak, a whisper lost in the roaring tide of the Dath's power. "It's too late for me. But you can still fight. Don't let it take you." Anna's heart clenched in her chest, but before she could move, before she could reach out to him, the shadows surged forward, engulfing him. He let out a ragged breath, and then his form dissolved into the darkness, swallowed whole by the Dath's hunger. "No!" Anna screamed, reaching toward the spot where Robert had been, but it was too late. He was gone. The darkness had claimed him again, just as it had claimed everyone before her. The walls of the church groaned, and the very air seemed to tremble, vibrating with the presence of the Dath. It was louder now, more intense, a deafening pulse that rattled her skull, made her vision blur, her thoughts scramble. The hunger roared inside her, demanding release, consuming every part of her. She could feel it in her veins, in the pit of her stomach, clawing at her. The altar before her began to glow, a sickly green light that flickered and flickered, casting long, twisted shadows on the walls. The symbols on the altar, the symbols that had been carved into the floor, into the very bones of Pine Hollow, began to pulse, glowing faintly, drawing her in. The hum grew louder, more insistent, vibrating through her bones, filling her head with images of destruction, of consumption, of endless hunger. "Join us, Anna," the voice whispered again, softer this time, like a lullaby. "You are one of us. The hunger is you, and you are the hunger." Her mind shattered under the weight of it all. She could no longer differentiate between herself and the darkness, the Dath. The hunger was part of her now. It was in her skin, in her thoughts, in her very soul. She could feel it clawing at her, pushing her, urging her to give in, to let it take her completely. But deep, deep within her, a flicker of resistance remained. "I won't," she gasped, her voice breaking. "I won't. Let it." Her vision blurred, and for a moment, everything faded into white. And then the whispers stopped. The Dath's presence, the crushing weight of it, receded. The glowing light from the altar faded, leaving Anna in a hollow silence, her ears ringing, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. She was alone again. No, not alone. She was never alone. The hunger inside her remained, but it was quieter now, its presence more subdued, as though it had retreated into the very core of her being. Anna felt it, though, It was there, coiled deep within her, waiting, feeding off her every thought, every emotion. The curse of Pine Hollow had claimed her, just as it had claimed so many before her. But Anna was not ready to surrender. She staggered to her feet, her legs shaking beneath her, but she stood tall. The hunger might be inside her, but she was still Anna Rivers. She was not going to let the Darth win. She wasn't going to let Pine Hollow, this town, be consumed by the curse that had taken it all. With trembling hands, Anna reached for the symbols on the altar, placing her palm against the stone, feeling the hum beneath her fingertips. The hunger inside her surged again, but she pushed against it. She closed her eyes, her mind racing. There had to be a way to stop this, to end the curse, to break the Darth's hold over her and over Pine Hollow. And in that moment, she realized something. The Darth fed on fear. It fed on hopelessness, on despair. It thrived in the darkness of the human soul. But Anna was not afraid, not anymore. "This ends now," she whispered, her voice filled with determination. The light flickered again, brighter this time, the symbols on the altar glowing as if they were alive. The shadows around her shrank back, recoiling from the light. The hunger, the Darth, roared in the distance, but it was fading. The battle wasn't over, but Anna was no longer running. She was fighting, and she would not be consumed. What? End of chapter 10, The Last Breath of Pine Hollow. This chapter marks Anna's final confrontation with the Darth, the ancient evil that has consumed Pine Hollow. She battles the hunger, the curse that has plagued the town for generations, and finds within herself the strength to fight back against the overwhelming force of the Darth. Though the struggle is far from over, Anna's determination and defiance signal that there is still hope. If she can find the way to break the curse, the chapter ends on a note of uncertain victory, leaving the final fate of Pine Hollow and Anna hanging in the balance.